On the 1st of December 1751, a baby took his first breaths in southern India. Few could have known that this particular baby boy would go on to be revered by his enemies and allies alike. For this baby would go on to become Sultan Fateh al-Sahab Tipu, better known to Westerners as Tipu Sultan. More than 2 centuries after his deaths at the hands of the British during the 1799 siege of Mysore, artefacts of his life remain on display at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, a testament to the awe with which he was held, and British triumphalism at having vanquished a shrewd adversary who posed a significant threat to their ambitions on the subcontinent. But who really was Tipu Sultan? Tonight, in another instalment of our series on marginalised figures from far-flung corners of the globe, Josh Provan makes a welcome return to the podcast to talk about this almost legendary figure in Indian history. We discuss his upbringing, the challenges that he faced as a ruler, and why his death was both the cause for the East India Company to breathe a sigh of relief, while also becoming a point of artistic memory. This is Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, which hopefully might actually function at this point in time, or it might not.
Nah.
It depends whether or not Spotify can be bothered to get off their arse, or if they're going to insist on the fact that I should wait 48 hours before they bother to investigate anything on why the podcast isn't working anymore. That might be a bit of a running theme across many episodes because I've just spent 4 hours arguing with the customer service department. If ever there was a misnomer in all of customer service, it was the idea that Spotify have a customer service department. Anyway, I suppose I should stop being churlish and actually focus on the professionalism side of being a podcast host. And introduce today's guest, who frankly needs no introduction. Wild East, every hazard and fatigue, bullocks, grain, and good Madeira. How many times have I told you to go and buy them? And I bet some of you still haven't bought them. Sort it out, people. Once again, we have the redoubtable master of adventures in Historyland, the Count Lando, Josh Provan, is in the house, looking very magisterial. Now, for you folks, it's only been a short while since you heard Josh, because of course you will have heard him on the Battle of the Marshals episodes, where he's done a splendid job as deputy judge, chair, jury, executioner, all of the above. But actually, Josh and I haven't sat down for the entire length of time since we recorded those, which were meant to be a Christmas special that never made it to air in time for Christmas. So Josh, welcome back. Great to see you again, my friend. I also am joined by the All People's Commissariat's Deputy Assistant, Associate Editor in Residence.
You almost said in chief there.
Yeah, I caught myself just in time. And I think we're going to need to give you an additional title besides the Bow, because I've just recorded with our colleague Josh Redden, who seems to have picked up your knack for just casually hurling insults my way in a ritualized form of abuse that is rapidly becoming a running joke on this show. I need to disassociate the two of you and do what I do for my students when they are being naughty and sit them on opposite sides of the room from their friends, because this is an authoritarian podcast and I'll be a dictator if I want to.
So the fact that we're on opposite sides of an ocean isn't enough?
Apparently not.
The American Revolution has begun.
Look, you don't encourage him.
I'm a little Whiggish. I will absolutely encourage the Americans if I want to.
Oh, heaven above. Putting you two on this episode was clearly a mistake. Funnily enough, though, an ocean isn't all that separates us from today's topic. We are looking at Tipu Sultan, whose name I'd probably ruin the pronunciation of there. The Tiger of Mysore, as he's more popularly known, a an individual who I'm trying to think of a better word than fetishized, because it's not quite as though he's fetishized, but there is a sort of element of Tipu is sort of put on a pedestal as this sort of very imposing, very um, serious threat, frankly, to Britain's efforts to expand in India. You've hopefully, if certainly if you've been lucky enough to go to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, will have seen the literal tiger of Mysore, that kind of wind up mechanism of a tiger clawing at a British redcoat, which is far more imposing and impressive if you see it in person than if you just look at it in a book. I had no idea. It was like the redcoat is literally the size of an actual redcoat. It's hugely impressive. No wonder the British decided, oh, yes, we'll steal that and take it back to England and put it in a museum where we can kind of congratulate ourselves on the fact that we managed to deal with this dastardly person. So, where am I going with all of this waffle? Well, firstly, we're going to deconstruct his life, talk about his impact and his legacy. But I'm particularly aware that we need in the process to talk about one of my new pet projects, which is India. Very much a topic where I'm.
Zach, as a Brit, you are not allowed to call India your pet project.
There may be problematic colonial undertones to what I just said.
So, I mean, I can play devil's advocate here as well. He has the East India Company flag behind him.
That is true, I do.
So, you attempt to sit there on your high horse, but actually your pedestal is made of sand.
He's a shill for the company.
Actually, in defense, this is not. I
I
should
know, I
point
know.
out
It's the Grand Union flag. I know.
yeah, it's the Ground Union flag of the United of the. It's the first American battle flag.
Mhm.
But
It looks
but
suspiciously like.
no, it does. It's almost identical except for the number of
Yeah,
stripes. That's the only
yeah.
difference.
The EIC has less stripes.
Yeah, fewer stripes.
So before I
Fun,
was
fun,
rudely
fun,
interrupted,
fun with flags.
welcome to
This
the
is our new monthly segment, Zach. Fun with flags.
hello and welcome to the Napoleonic Wars pod. Um, I am going to insist on order. The iron fist shall be placed upon this podcast. And I'm going to actually do something novel, which is ask a question rather than just waffle, because actually Luke's kind of alluding to it there in terms of that the language and the cultures and the way in which people even think about India being uh, basically based on a lot of misconceptions. And this is one of the things that plagues my research, certainly. The degree of assumption that the British originally had when they went out to India and have continued to have for the intervening 200 years. So I want to kind of deal with that culture shock element, because most folks will be assuming that the way politics works in India is the same that it does in the UK, or at least that it did. Um, and I think it's useful for us to just go on a whistle stop tour of Mysore in the late 18th century. How has the region kind of tried to navigate the initial rivalries between Britain and France on the subcontinent, which is how British military involvement in India really starts off, trying to basically force the French out so that the East India Company can access all of the markets. And then obviously it snowballs from there. But how has Mysore kind of dealt with these two warring bands of white people fundamentally? And then also how they dealt with the emergence of Britain as the victor of that struggle?
Well, I mean, Mysore as a state, as a kingdom, goes back quite a long way. And originally it was a Hindu kingdom, ruled by the Wadhya dynasty. And by the 18th century, what you're getting in India is, well, a great series of problems arising that each kingdom has to try and manage for itself. This is the downfall of the Mughal Empire. This creates a massive power vacuum in very intricate ways, because whether or not they actually controlled the kingdoms of India or whether or not they just received a tax from them, you're still dealing with some sort of a bureaucratic chain of authority going back to Delhi. And that exists in Mysore, where you have a theoretical assumption of Mughal sovereignty. They give a tax to the emperor. But when the Mughals fall, and by the beginning of the 18th century, they're absolutely in full-on decline. Nothing stopping them. Certainly after the reign of Aurangzeb, you're getting problems inside of problems, where your Mysore's own governors and people who are kind of their own little princes who give you lip service and tax and vassalage say, oh, well, the Mughals are down, so I will declare myself my own principality. And so you're getting disintegration across a wide scale. Into that, you have the European powers, which are another complexity, which at the time are not actually as big a deal as everybody thinks. At the time, the big, powerful kingdoms in India kind of see the Europeans as useful special forces who they can pay to involve themselves in their wars generally. Now, this backfired a lot of times, and of course, the Mughals mishandled the British terribly and ended up having to basically give them Bengal. But at the same time, you have to remember that the British at this time are servants of the Mughals as well. The reason they have Bengal, even though practically it doesn't really matter, theoretically and sort of in sort of like a wider sense, they do still sort of work for the Mughals. They are the Diwan in Bengal. They collect his taxes, and they still have, there is still sort of a lip service to Delhi from the British at this point. They don't own a great deal of territory, and they're not interested actually at this point. And in the early 18th, mid 18th century, they're not interested in it. They want to make money. Like administering vast swathes of territory is just a bad business plan in the middle of the 18th century. So you're getting the Europeans are not as problematic as they seem until the 7 Years' War, when they start actively fighting each other for control of trade, essentially. And the French do okay, to be honest, through the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, especially during the American Revolution. But they do lose important territory. They do lose important trading presence in India. And so by the end of the American Revolution, although Admiral Suffren has done a rather bang-up job in the Indian Ocean, they've lost Pondicherry, they've lost most of their main presence, and they are reduced to their sort of, I don't know, subversive mercenary presence in various states. The British, again, are starting to exert themselves a bit more now that they have more elbow room. They figure we can actually get rid of all of the French. Now, how this affects Mysore is interesting because of Mysore's sort of famous rise to power as one of the big three Indian, or as they used to call it, country powers in the mid to late 18th century. And all like the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, it's all tied into that. How did they survive that without getting too involved with the French or the British? And that's down to a gentleman by the name of Hyder Ali, or I believe is I think his entire title is something like Nawab Hyder Ali Khan Bahadur. And he is an amazing individual, and he is a fascinating character, and possibly the guy we might want to have talked about today, to be honest. But he's not as famous as his son, so we're going to move on. He was a soldier in the Mysore army, and by 1758 he's a commander, and he takes Bangalore and he becomes a Nawab. And then he takes power from the Wodeyar dynasty in 1761, declares himself Sultan. From 1761 to 1780, just before he dies, he expands Mysore, makes it completely dependent upon itself. Although he would love to create coalitions, he can't quite make them stick. He comes really, really close on a couple of occasions, and on one occasion he almost breaks British power entirely in India. But it doesn't happen. But he is the reason that Mysore remains a sort of one of the big independent powers that the British have to deal with rather than control.
I love the idea of country powers. It feels just like, it's somewhere in Madras, there's an stiff upper lip going, no, 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 you got to put on your tweed before you fight them. They're in the country, not in the city, you know. Um, all right, so fair enough. And yeah, I mean, all three of us on this podcast know enough about Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan to sort of lead this in. But for our listeners, and actually this is something I've been curious about too, as someone who's largely familiar with this from the British point of view. How does Tipu and Mysore's government work on a practical level?
Mhm. It's an autocracy, and it works similar to most autocracies across India. At the top, you have the ruler. If you're a Hindu ruler, you're probably a Raja or a Maharaja, and that just means king or king of kings. Or you are a sultan. If you are a Muslim, then you will be a sultan. Or if you are one of the many of the galaxy of um, little states connected to the Mughals, if one of the little galaxy of states that the Mughals control and they dole out titles and administrative things, which become their own little principalities and then sort of become independent, you will have titles like Nawab or Nizam, and those indicate the rulers of Islamic kingdoms that were closely connected to the Mughals, which is why they're not sultans. The title is enough, but they still sort of derive their power from the emperor, but they're independent. Those are the rulers in general. If you want to go even further into like the outer sphere, then you have the emperor of the Afghan emperor of the Durrani dynasty in the north. You have the Shah of Persia, Shahenshah, I should say, in Persia. This is the sort of the galaxy of titles you're dealing with. But so next to and slightly below the ruler, you have the Diwan, who is sometimes called a vizier. He's a prime minister, and oftentimes the most powerful political force in the country. And that is why so many of them usurp their rulers, lock them away in palaces somewhere, and rule in their name. It happens all the time. It happened multiple times to the Marathas. It basically happened to the Mughals various times throughout their empire, and technically it happened in Mysore when Hyder Ali took power. Um, you also have figures like finance minister. He's also very important, and very often, I say very often, but now and again, the finance ministers accrue such power from their own. They're often very brilliant people in terms of managing the finances of the kingdom. So they tend to be highly intelligent and sometimes quite ambitious. And sometimes these guys will take control. They won't become the Diwan. They'll just still be the finance minister, but they will have political power. And they will often also exile the prime minister to another country house somewhere. And again say I'm doing the will of the prime minister who is doing the will of the sultan, both of whom you cannot see today. You can only see me, and you can get this sort of layered puppeteering thing going on. Around them, you have army generals and governors. And these guys are often related to the dynasty in some way. They're sometimes princes, they're sometimes just effective soldiers, a little bit like Hyder Ali. And they come and go. Some of them can become the prime minister. Some of them can become the finance minister. Some of them just remain generals and sort of like the strong arm and the sword of the state sort of thing. And And then it's not to be discounted the politics of the harem, which can be used by any of the principal players to influence any of the principal players. And for instance, in Hyderabad, you can read a lot about the harem politics in Hyderabad if you read William Dalrymple's White Mughals. And if you want to read about a finance minister who takes power, you need to read about Nana Fadnavis in the Marathas. And if you want to read about the Diwans taking power from Maharajas and Sultans, then you basically just need to read Indian history because that happens all the time. Um, so this is a sort of a nutshell of how these autocracies work. There's usually more nuance depending on where you are and which one you're talking about specifically, but that's as far as I can get in terms of generalizing it.
Can I just say it's remarkable how hard it is to efficiently and neatly summarize the complexity of Indian politics, and that is a stellar job. That is probably the clearest explanation I've come across in 12 months of working in this field. So fair play there, Josh. I couldn't have managed that level of clarity because my answer would have been it's complicated because it is.
In fairness, not an inaccurate summation.
No, no, you can get away with
True,
it.
true. Um, so before we go on to talk about the Tiger of Mysore, as it were, I just want to sort of dig into what it's like for local individuals. I don't want to start talking about class systems. I don't actually want to start talking about caste systems, much though everybody would think, oh, well, what he really means is a caste system. Well, I kind of don't, because one of the big developments, well, big, it's not even particularly recent, but one of the things that historians of India during this period have increasingly realized is that the caste system is basically a thing that is probably at least 50% made up by the British when they pitch up and kind of go, oh, we're looking for classes and we're looking for hierarchies, and basically what they do is sort of transplant a whole load of vaguely misunderstood messages that they get from the locals, and then they stick to it like glue rather than sort of actually working out how Indian society does work and why this system is much more complex. And then, of course, because they insist on retrofitting it, that sort of then gets absorbed into the sort of the culture of India, and so it kind of gets retrofitted in some respects. It's complicated, is what I'm getting at. But rather than talk about the nature of the class system, I do want to just talk about what it's like to be an ordinary person, a you and me, in India during this period. Like day to day, what does their life look like? And what implications does that have for how they think about these wars between the people that, as far as they were concerned, have been in charge for the last, well, in the case of Mysore, we're talking what? Change of government in the 1780s? When is it that Hyder Ali takes over?
Hyder well, he proclaims himself to be Sultan in 1761, but the Mysore state is goes back into the 14th and 13th centuries.
Okay. So you've got these white people who sort of try and come in and they want to sort of make out that they're in charge now.
Mhm. Okay.
What implication does that have for everyday folks? And how I almost want to say, would they obviously be aware of the changes that are going on at the top, besides the fact that you've got a different army marching through the region at this point in time?
I don't think it was obvious to people from what I've seen what's happening at the top, to be honest. I think it's quite clear that much as across every nation you would care to choose, a population is much more concerned with how I make my living, where I get my food from, than who really is running the place. Most people will, except in times of extreme historical importance and unity, which tends to be rare, that most people will kind of just get on board with whoever's in charge, and if they don't like it, they'll leave and go somewhere else. In India, in Mysore, southern India, you are looking at I mean, it's we're talking ancient civilization. It's not the civilization the British prefer at first. They kind of get more on board with Mughal civilization at first, and they kind of sideline Southern Hindu um, cultures. And then slowly it kind of reverses itself, and they start to sort of talk about, what the in quotes true India is supposed to be. And that's more of like a scholarly discussion that the British have as time goes on, rather than a sort of from a policy standpoint. I mean, you get a similar kind of class system that you get in other places in Asia. You have you have you have a religious class of priests, whether they're Muslims or whether they're Hindus. You have an aristocracy, which is generally the governing class and the warrior class. And very often throughout India, what you'll get is warrior classes that were once highly sought after mercenaries establishing some sort of power base and then becoming a state. That happened in the Punjab, and that happened in the Marathas, with the Marathas as well. And then you have um, the artisans and artists and things, and there's a great flourishing of that throughout India in the 18th century and the late 17th century, especially in the north, where you have a lot of patrons with a lot of money who want to pay artists to decorate their homes and create memorable objects for them. Poetry as well. These writers and things like that have always been highly prized in India, especially in Islamic courts. In Hindu courts as well, but oftentimes because the Mughals were technically in charge, you would hire in Muslim scholars and Muslim poets to write Sufi poetry and things like that. If you were particularly interested in one thing or another, you could get who you wanted if you had the money. Then you have the farmers and the fishermen and the people who feed the country, essentially. Also highly respected people, usually connected sometimes with the aristocracy who own a lot of the land. And usually right at the bottom, you have merchants who just make money. And I think that there are similar structures throughout India, and it does depend where in India you're talking about and at what time. Their relationship to the British is very, or the French or the Portuguese before them, is again it's almost an individual kind of thing. To your average person living in India, uh, the British are foreign, but so is someone from the Punjab. If you are from Mysore, you won't speak the language. They will be foreigners for you. They will liken the appearance of British and European people to Kashmiris, who are quite pale. And this is sort of how they'll sort of navigate. This is just sort of how they'll navigate the European interference. Essentially they're Christians. They don't really know what that is. The Europeans don't make a big deal of pressing religion at first, so they don't. There are fewer problems at first and in this period with the British being obnoxious to people as a general, like the general population of people, than you get later. What you do get at this period is you get war. You get lots of it. From the 7 Years' War, from 1755, 1750, if you like, all the way to 1803, through southern India, western India, central India, northern India. The Marathas fight Hyderabad. The Marathas fight the Duranis. The Duranis come down and destroy the Marathas at Panipat and create a whole different power dynamic. Hyderabad fights the Marathas. Hyderabad fights Mysore. Mysore fights the Marathas. Mysore fights back against Hyderabad. Sometimes they fight the British. Sometimes the British get allies with one of the other ones and they fight with one of the other ones. And it is a deeply, deeply troublesome time. It is a deeply dark time for people caught up in the middle of this because it's almost an endless sequence of some war happening almost every year between 1750 and 1803. In specifically speaking, the time between the Maratha Civil War and the end of the Anglo-Maratha War is called Guldi Ka Waqt, which is the time of trouble. There's even reports of like tigers and wild animals populating areas where people have fled. There are absolutely harrowing accounts of British armies moving through these territories that have had nothing but decades of war, depopulation and famine, of seeing the effects of this, seeing starvation caused by this, and it's almost unrelenting. And so it is a very unstable time, mostly all starting with the fall of the Mughals and the rise of new powers and the collision of new powers. It's you can make your way, and it's not as bad everywhere as it seems, but there are serious problems being one of the ordinary people in India at this time.
Yeah, what you're describing there is precisely the environment that Mornington, our Wellington's brother, as he will become, Arthur Wellesley's brother, goes on to exploit as an excuse fundamentally for
Yeah.
a very aggressive campaign of expansion in India. But
Yes.
we'll get to that in another episode, I suspect. Just to go back to the Tiger of Mysore, as it were. So we've got a sense of the world that he's born into. What do we know about him in his early life? How I guess how does that influence the person that he becomes? Because I'm very sort of aware, and spoiler alert here, folks, that when he does eventually come to power, one of the things that he is kind of saddled with is the legacy of conflict with the British.
Yeah. Tipu was born in 1751. So just before his father comes to power, before he becomes Nawab and before he becomes Sultan. He's born to who I presume is one of the principal wives of Hyder Ali. I don't actually know how many wives he had. Maybe I'm making an assumption there because Tipu had a couple of wives. And her name was Fatima Fakir Nisa. And um, older boys are usually taken away from the care of the women fairly young and then given an education, a more masculine education. Usually, and Tipu was unlike his father. Tipu was given the education of a prince. This is not something he was necessarily born to be, because in 1751 Hyder was a general. Uh, but one of the things that makes Hyder kind of special and probably a pretty tough father to have is that some people say he was a sepoy when he started and a mercenary when he got going, that he was illiterate and that he had basically a photographic memory and was excellent with numbers. And so you have this guy who's pulled himself up almost literally from his like the shoulder straps of his knapsack, if you're going to believe the sepoy angle. And then he becomes basically king. And so all of a sudden, little Tipu is a prince, and but he will benefit from that education because he's given an education that his father never had. He becomes very accomplished in calligraphy. He becomes appreciative of the arts, But he's also trained in the hunt. He loves hunting. Becomes very obsessed with tigers, especially. And he also joins his father on campaign. And so he gets to experience victory over various enemies, especially the British, who his father basically holds to a draw or defeats, depending how you want to read it, between the First and Second Mysore Wars. The First Mysore War must have been quite a show because he was losing, and then he just suddenly basically dodged around the British and basically darted straight at Madras, and everybody lost their minds and said, "Peace, please. Let's end the war now." He was a brilliant general and a great leader and a very capable statesman. You did not want to mess with this guy if you didn't know what you were doing because he could just pull stuff out of a hat. And Tipu would have learned alongside him, watched him do stuff, but he did it. But he didn't have the practical sort of experience that Hyder had. He had a different upbringing. He didn't have possibly the grit that Hyder had. But he was with them at Pollilure in the 1780s when they destroyed Colonel Bally's force in the Second Mysore War, and that's a huge deal. That's actually where Tipu becomes known to the British as Hyder's killer son, who like helped destroy a British detachment. So he absolutely inherits a rivalry with the British, a hatred of the British, and a suspicion of the British through these sequences of wars. Hyder dies in 1780 or 1781, I think, just before the Second Mysore War ends, and Tipu carries on with the way that war is going, and he remains, I think the credit is that the last Indian ruler to dictate terms to the British in a treaty which ends the Second Mysore War. And so you have this fascinating thing with Tipu of a guy who is not meant to be a king when he's born, then gets educated to be a king, becomes kind of a shining example of like nobility and Indian chivalry, if you want to call it. A very heroic figure when he was a young man. And then all of a sudden, he becomes Sultan on the death of his father, and he inherits everything that Hyder was trying to do, but without Hyder's experience to do it.
Okay, so he takes power in December 1782 with this combination of the education that his father had, but lacking the practical education that his father had. What are the pressing things that require his attention? And I don't just mean, obviously, the looming threat from Madras, although that is obviously part of this, right? Once the British show up on a continent, you can't ignore them. But them and other stuff, what's going on? What's let's continue the metaphor. What's stalking him like the tiger through the jungle?
Uh, the ambition of his father, the expansion of the state, the kingdom of Mysore, control of the Carnatic, and access to the sea. He'd love a navy. Hyder had a small navy, but it never really got anywhere. And then the upgrade, then the search for allies and coalitions, which again Hyder was always keen on trying to do, only managed partly once to do it. And then he's also looking to keep the army strong and up to date because I think that he was foresighted enough to know that there's going to be more trouble, whether it's with the British or whether it's with the Marathas or Hyderabad. It doesn't particularly matter. The state needs to have the army strong for it to succeed. So he also wants to upgrade. He also wants to be a sort of be seen as a beneficent ruler, and he wants to encourage temple building, and um, he will obviously upgrade his own palaces and royal residences and government facilities. He wants to look into communications and roads and things like that. So there is a lot of things that he is going to try and do. and sort of jump into without because he has to, because now he's Sultan. Now he is Tipu Sultan.
Okay, so it's all kind of he's got a vision, he's got education, but then there's a problem. And that problem, of course, is the third, and there are two wars that we're going to particularly talk about, both with similar names. That's the third Anglo-Mysore War. We'll get to the fourth Anglo-Mysore War. Um, but talk us through why, well, I guess how does this come about, but also crucially, why it ends up being such a problem and why it kind of hamstrings him for a chunk of the remainder of his time as ruler.
Well, the third Mysore War is brought brought about because of his continuing expansionist policies towards the Carnatic, which the British will not tolerate, and Hyderabad is also suspicious of. And the Marathas don't like it either, because remember, Tipu and his father to the Marathas is a heretic usurper to Hyderabad, who was the Subadar of the Mughals in the south, to the Nizam. He is just a Muslim usurper, the son of a ranker who got above his station and took power. We don't like that. Also, you've been fighting us for a while, so we don't like that. To the British, he's trying to get to the sea and exert dominance over the Carnatic coast and is expanding southwards. This is problematic for our because he hates us and he doesn't want to trade with us. Now, obviously, wiser heads might have said maybe we can do a deal with Tipu, maybe we can just get on board with this. But to be honest with you, it would have been such a problem to try and navigate either alienating Hyderabad or the Marathas in so doing that. So it was easier to keep Mysore as the great enemy. And it was useful to have an excuse to go to war, and Mysore was often that excuse. And so because Tipu continued to in quotes, hazard the Carnatic and, supposedly threatened even, Portuguese Christians there because he has a reputation as being not only a temple builder, but a temple destroyer and a person who forced conversions on people. And there's a whole tortured legacy far beyond what the British think of him today in India. It goes beyond what the British have to do with him, which you may or may not want to get into, but it's part of who he is. And so the British at this point have also a slight hiccup in that they don't really know what they're doing. The removal of Sir Warren Hastings and the endless trial that occurs throughout the majority of the late 18th century, which is like going to the cinema for people. It was a thing that never died and was a constant source of scandal and interest as to this guy who doesn't seem to be as villainous as some people think he was. Actually, he might have actually had some good ideas, but nevertheless, that may be a whole different podcast in itself. But anyway, Warren Hastings is out. He is replaced by a number of guys, one of whom is the Marquis of Cornwallis, who is the guy who lost to the Americans at Yorktown. He comes over, and if I'm remembering the really confusing chain of governors general in Bengal, does he? I think he comes after the acting governorship of Sir John Shaw. And Shaw is seen as a very kind of he either comes this is the problem. He either comes before Cornwallis or after Cornwallis, but because Cornwallis comes back again, I'm getting a little confused as to the timeline here. But basically, the British were at home were of the opinion that people were scared of fighting in India now. The East India Company itself was getting the reputation, and within its own board, of placating the, in quotes, country powers, which is something you should never do. You should always have a strong face and, take the stick out of the cupboard and thrash these people every now and again just to show them who's boss. And that they were being too nice to everybody and that they weren't sort of showing a good enough front. Cornwallis was sent out to kind of redress this, and Cornwallis lands in India, and he starts reforming everything left, right, and center because he's trying to clean up after the supposed mess that Hastings left behind. And he's the reason why people of mixed birth can't have commissions in the East India Company Army. He reforms the army to expand its capabilities, and it makes it bigger than the British Army practically, which confuses a lot of people. And many, many things Cornwallis does when he gets there, one of which is to deal with Mysore. And Mysore basically needs, as far as the British are concerned, it needs to be contained. It needs to be stopped. You're going too far, too fast. Tipu is looking like he's some sort of version of his father, and we've got to do something about him. Between John Shaw and Cornwallis, what they managed to do is actually quite impressive, and that is form a coalition against Mysore, which includes the Marathas and Hyderabad. The Third Mysore War revolves around the attempt to take Seringapattna, which in those days was called Seringapatam, which is the mightiest fortress in Mysore. It sits on an island in the middle of the River Cauvery, and was a majestic looking place and very difficult to attack because you have to first of all march to it, and then you have to surround it, and then you have to get into it. Cornwallis mistimed it and ended up having to retreat because the monsoon hit, and he couldn't sustain himself there anymore. There's this particularly ribald cartoon, I don't know if it was Atkinson or whatever, who drew a picture of Cornwallis riding away in confusion while Tipu stands strategically upon the battlements, and a suspicious shower of liquid comes from a place quite out of sight, but within anatomical relativity, to Tipu, showering Cornwallis as he runs away. You can derive from whatever you wish, but it's essentially he was shown the door. Now, Cornwallis, however, was a capable soldier despite the reputation of Yorktown. He had a lot of connections, and he did come back. And Tipu felt that he would not be able to chase him away again. So a treaty was signed in which he gave up a fair amount of territory. I forget the actual percentage, but a fair amount of territory. And famously, he sent two of his sons as hostages to Cornwallis to ensure, to prove his good faith, and that got turned into a immensely famous painting, which now is in the National Army Museum in London. Go see it if you want to get just lose a couple of hours just staring at all the details. And the surrender of the sons of Tipu is a huge deal for the British. And it's strangely a huge deal for Tipu as well, because this is the first time his legend starts to be formed by the British. You have this monster in his island castle who's who's the tiger of Mysore and stuff like that, who surrenders his sons to the enemy. And then fatherly old Cornwallis greets them and ushers them safely into the tent and chivalrously takes care of them until all the business is dealt with, and then they can return home. And this was immortalized in art forms, and there are engravings of it. There are multiple versions of the surrender of the sons of Tipu, and all of a sudden everybody knows who this guy is, even in Britain, because this is some sort of classical homage happening, which people are getting on board with. For Tipu, it's an embarrassment. It's a reality check. He realizes now the British are a very dangerous, proper threat to his own kingdom, his own rule, and he needs those allies, and he starts reaching out to them. He starts to reach out to the French. He has a brief correspondence with Napoleon. He reaches out to Zaman Shah in Afghanistan, of the Durrani Empire. Two people that are calculated to make the British say, good grief, he's more dangerous than we thought. He wants to, he's going to wipe us all out. It's citoyen Tipu, and we've got to do something about this guy before we end up with the French army wandering around India, or the Afghans come back surging through the mountain passes and wiping out everybody as they go. It's a trigger. It's a trigger for what comes next. Tipu doesn't really recover from it because although it kind of ends ambiguously, in reality, it's the beginning of British supremacy over Mysore and the isolation of Mysore. Because remember, they managed to get people who hate each other to all come to Seringapatam and make it surrender. So it's not good news for Tipu, and it's isolating him.
It's the caricature is by Gil Ray, by the
Thank
way.
you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no worries. And I want to jump on that for a second. So much of what our average listener will know about the Tipu comes from British depictions, right? It is the surrender of his sons. It is the pissing on Lord Cornwallis and thus on British prestige. It is the legends of him, yes, it is the Clockwork Tiger. It is the legends of him employing strongmen to drive nails into prisoners' skulls and all of that. How much of this is, I mean, obviously, all of it is propaganda, but how much of this is propaganda drawn from life, drawn from legitimate sources? And how much of this is the British demonization of a man who, at that point, they clearly considered to be one of, if not the premier threat to British rule in the subcontinent?
Well, like with a lot of propaganda, you can dig back into it to a certain extent and you will find some kind of truth. But with but you have to be careful with it because it never usually comes from the place that it's said to come from. With Tipu and the demonization of Tipu by the British, this was a very calculated thing that happened, and it was easy to do for them because nobody liked him. With none of his neighbors liked him. Like I said before, he was the son of the usurper, the awful military coup that happened, and they were able to spin a great deal of Islamic fanaticism tropes on him as well, because he could become the enemy of the Hindus and he was the enemy of the Mughals. So it's easy to form coalitions to fight this guy. And the problem is that we see his cruelty from a modern standpoint, and even from a sort of early 19th century European standpoint of what is deemed accepted cruelty is not the same as what it was in India at this time. Tipu is very similar to a European ruler of the late 17th century. He's actually quite similar to some European rulers of the early 18th century. And he will remain similar to even some later rulers as we go through time in Europe. He's not, it's not, cruelty from autocrats is not something that is like the preserve of India. However, the British were controlling their own narrative to their own people for their own reasons. This was, their propaganda was disseminated in different ways to different people. To the Indian powers, they just said, he's a usurper. We want to restore the Wodeyars to the throne. He's dangerous because he upsets the balance of power here. He would like to see any of you guys in his dungeons in Seringapatam. Meanwhile, to the British public, they said, this is a monster who locks up Christians, who locks up officers in flooded dungeons, who drives nails through the heads of the people he opposes. He breaks temples. He persecutes people. We need to bring the enlightenment of constitutional democracy to these places, and restore a more beneficent regime there. Could Tipu be cruel? Yes, absolutely. He could be cruel. He was an autocrat. His word was law. He was incredibly good to be friends with, and you just didn't want to be his enemy. and you didn't want to fall into you didn't want to fall into his hands if you were his enemy. This could be said of any ruler in India, including the British up to a point. And I mean, you can look at the Maratha Civil War for comparisons if you like. You had active attempts to wipe out other factions. They tortured people, they put people in dungeons, they exiled people, fled into exile. The British similarly were not kind to rebels. And Tipu had those same responsibilities. If you rebelled against him, he will make an example out of some of you. He will not, however, completely wipe out an entire race of people because he is an Indian ruler and he understands the concept of plurality. It's a myth that he was the enemy of Hinduism. He he built as many temples, possibly as more than he destroyed, and they were his subjects. You can't as a Muslim minority, you can't it's not particularly a good idea to make enemies of a Hindu majority. So he followed the advice, he followed the way that rulers have ruled in India up to that point, and basically you take it as it comes. And I don't think Tipu was particularly fanatical when it came to exerting the rule of Islam over Mysore. He's obviously going to have a slight prejudice towards it. I mean, if he gets a bunch of guys who want to say, we want to build mosques here, he's probably going to say, well, as long as it's a settled enough place, fine, do that. I like that idea. He probably would, it's just natural that some people are going to have a prejudice towards their own religion, but it's not oppressive. He's no more oppressive than the Nizam. He's no more oppressive than the Peshwa or any of the Maharajas in the north. And he's at the second no more oppressive than the British. It's just that he was the enemy of the British, and therefore he becomes oppressive to them. Is there truth to the propaganda that he could be cruel? There's no reason to doubt that he could be cruel. General Baird and officers who survived, who were taken prisoner at Pollilur, described what they went through, what they endured in the dungeons of Seringapatam, which is a living nightmare. Now, it could be embellished, but there's unfortunately no reason to think that it's not true to some extent. And that's just the nature of war when it gets to this level and you don't respect the enemy anymore. So that's a bit of a rambling way of saying that Tipu should not be seen particularly. The only reason to demonize Tipu is if you have some axe to grind. Otherwise, he's just a ruler like anybody else, and quite a exceptional one, as it turns out.
So we've been dancing around the edge of this, the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. There's a lot of really important.
Let's talk about that axe.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I often see Tipu as somebody who's broadly speaking pragmatic in his approach, something of a realist, frustrated by circumstance, particularly after the Third War, and yet there isn't a sense to me that the Fourth War is a foregone conclusion. Everybody loves to bang on about, well, this is the only time that Wellington gets beaten. Many reasons why we could poke a pin in that particular assertion, but we don't have the time here and now. But the broader point from that is that the British / company forces don't have it all their own way. So talk us through the extent to which the outcome of this war was or wasn't a given, and how we end up, I guess, in this situation, how it's sort of engineered.
It's engineered out of Tipu's ill-advised attempts to garner allies from people who are even easier for the British to say are the enemy. The Shah in Afghanistan is the bogeyman of India. The British correspondence at this time is obsessed with the idea that an Afghan horde is going to descend on Hindustan like they did it in 1761, and they're going to come straight down and they're going to wipe out everybody. They said this, what they do very cleverly is to basically send emissaries to the Shah of Persia. And the Shah of Persia is they do a deal with him to say, if you can sort of threaten the Afghans' western flank, please, and make sure that he's too occupied over here to bother coming into India, we'd really appreciate it and we'll give you money. And the Shah of Persia was like, yeah, awesome. That's a good idea. I hate that guy. He calls himself Shahenshah, like I'm not the King of Kings. And the biggest problem for Tipu is that he is in correspondence with the French at a time when Richard Wellesley has become Governor General in Bengal, with the stated aim of driving all French influence out of India entirely. And he wants to do this by his subsidiary system and the so-called forward policy, which aims to remove the foreign policy element from all Indian kingdoms that comes into it. You can still technically rule. We're just going to put a garrison into your town, into your country. We're going to put a resident in there as well. And they're going to deal with all the foreign policy stuff because you people can't be trusted not to fight each other for 5 minutes. And so the only way to ensure peace in our time is for the British to monopolize everything. This is not actually what the British government wanted him to do, but he had a conversation with a guy in Cape Town on the way over, and he thought it was a really cool idea, and he ran with it.
But also, can I just say, this is Mornington, whose basic stance throughout all of this period is, look, if you want to get a letter to me, you're going to have to write it, stick it on a boat. It'll take about 6 to 9 months to reach me. I'll then write a response telling you what you can do with this particular letter, which will probably amount to the fact that you can use it in your morning toilet. And then I can send that back to you and it'll take another 6 to 9 months. So basically, I'm 18 months away from replying to anything that you send to me. So I'm just going to create facts on the ground. That's basically his plan. And it works.
It does.
Has catastrophic consequences for
yes.
India as a subcontinent, for the East India Company as well. That's another episode. But sorry, I interrupted you just
no,
for
it's true.
a Mornington rant. But
it's absolutely the case. Now, he did have slight tacit approval from Dalrymple. Is it Dalrymple, I mean? No, it's a D word, but I've forgotten what it is. Moving on to save space, but I believe I think is the Foreign Secretary or something like that, or responsible for the colony. That annoying. Anyway, he does have tacit approval from the government, but not full understanding of how far he's going to go, right? And he comes into India and he sees the situation, he sees the opportunities that you talked about in Cape Town. First job, Hyderabad. He takes out Hyderabad, and he does this very, very relatively smoothly from the inside. The Raymond's corps of French mercenaries are replaced by sepoys just before 1799. And he gets British ambassadors in there. And so Hyderabad is part of the subsidiary system. He also gets the Nawab of Awadh. He also gets other Carnatic states. He gets a whole bunch of people into the club who think, actually, this is actually okay. That's fine. I don't really like paying for the upkeep of my own forces. I pay mercenaries now, so I'll just pay the British to defend me. Awesome. Great. They're great at fighting. That'll be good. That'll be good. And so a lot of people swap out the French for the British. The Marathas resist this because the Marathas have a very strong policy of not getting involved with anybody, which is really annoying to the British, but they can't get in there. And this means that Mysore is next on the list. The problem is finding an excuse to attack them. Mornington has, however, a trump card to play in which that if he can find the least bit of French influence in an Indian court, he can use that as the excuse to attack them because Britain is at war with France. And the French governor of, I want to say it's Mauritius, lets the cat out of the bag by proclaiming an alliance with Tipu. He does this without orders. It's a misunderstanding. He thinks he's supposed to do this. But of course, he's not supposed to do this. And it doesn't have a big it doesn't have a fallout for him. But this now means that Mornington has the bat with which to hit Tipu over the head with. And he starts a correspondence with Tipu, basically saying, hey, what's all this about the French? I'm at war with the French, right? This could be serious. And Tipu's like, I don't know what this is about. And Mornington says, you're a liar. And Tipu says, no, I'm not a liar. And he says, right, well, you have to get rid of all the French people in your court and do a lot of deals with me now. Otherwise, I'm going to invade. And of course, Tipu says, no, that's not right. Dundas, thank you very much. Yes, the chap I was rambling about before is Dundas. So Henry Dundas did give Mornington some tacit approval to kind of make peace in India, do a Pax Britannica thing. Anyway, in the name of all of that, we get the Fourth Mysore War because Tipu does not respond to the ultimatum, and he is seen as an enemy of the British because he's supposedly allied with the French, and which, I mean, come on, the reality of the French connection is very dodgy, to be honest. He had a couple of letters from Napoleon. People make so much of the Napoleon letters. Being someone who thinks that even Napoleon didn't believe he was actually going to invade India by attacking Egypt, I find it very difficult to actually see any reality in the idea that Napoleon was indeed going to march across the Persian Empire, probably try and ally with the Afghans, and then go into India. I just don't see it happening. I think he just kept his rainy day options open and said, "Oh yeah, let's just cause trouble. Let's just cause trouble with the British and encourage the Indians to fight them over there because I can't do squat." And so Tipu is left isolated. He has no allies. The Afghans aren't coming because they're bothered about the Persians. The French aren't coming because, well, Napoleon doesn't have a fleet or any way to get there. And frankly, I think he'd given up on the kill Britain by killing India thing by this point. He's alone, and he knows the British can get to Seringapatam, or as it's called, Srirangapatna. The British organize one heck of a campaign because they know now that we need a big army. We need it to be supplied for months. It needs to get there in time to beat the monsoon. And effectively, Tipu needs that monsoon to happen again. It's not a foregone conclusion for the British because things can happen. It's not easy to take this place. It's a long march. Tipu has a big army. He has excellent irregular cavalry. It is a nightmare to fight in India. And up to this point, the British have not been 100% successful in everything they do. They're very good at taking stuff when they get to it, but actually, if you can stop them getting to it, there's a chance you can survive and fight another day. The problem is the British get to Seringapatam. Tipu is incapable of stopping them. He tries at the Battle of Malavelli, but the British swat him aside like he's I don't know, like a bunch of bees, basically. And his infantry are completely repulsed by British volley fire, even though they're outnumbered. His cavalry are irregular cavalry. They can't make an impression on the dragoons and the sepoy and the native cavalry. He has to retreat, and so he comes up with the fairly logical idea of burning everything as he retreats to Seringapatam. This does cause problems. Arthur Wellesley is involved in this. He has been specifically requested to be attached to the Nizam of Hyderabad's detachment, which is a vital part of this. They couldn't have done it without the Nizam of Hyderabad. The Marathas are also supposed to be there, but they're dragging their heels and they won't show up until later. Because they also are too suspicious of the British actually defeating Tipu. And so they get to Seringapatam, and that is the problem. Because once the British get to a place, the odds increase exponentially that they will take it, because they have the cannons and they know how to scientifically approach walls. And all of this nasty stuff that Indian fortresses are not built to sort of sustain. Seringapatam has actually been updated. It's got sloping bastion walls, which are supposed to sort of make it a little bit more difficult to hit, but it's still a massive, stone white city sitting on top of a rock in the middle of an island. So there are curtain walls you can hit, and they get hit. You mentioned Wellington's only defeat. That occurs at a place called Sultan Dope, which is part of the operations to clear the area in front of Seringapatam so the guns can be pushed forward into the trenches. We don't need to get into that at this point. It's not a very big occurrence. It is mostly favoritism, accusations of favoritism, because he's the Governor General's brother, and some people don't like the fact that he has been given a senior position in the army. The guns are in place. They open fire. They do what they're supposed to do. The walls come down. General Baird is given the honor of leading the charge across the almost dry, it's about 3 feet deep, River Calvary in places, up onto the bastions to get into the fortress, secure the gates. That should be job done. There's sort of ideas of like sort of psychological warfare that the British waited for like the worst part of the day to attack, thinking that the Mysore troops would be kind of sort of hunkering down out of the sun. Don't know if that's particularly true or not, but they did go in at about noon, midday, and they took the breach, in quotes, in fine style. Baird had some axes to grind, as Luke mentioned. This is a theme. He had been locked up in the dungeons in there, and he was very keen to settle the score. And so he took the breach, and then comes the death of Tipu. Like I say, Tipu wasn't just a silk-clad prince who came out and rode around with his dad. He had seen how to lead from the front. He had experienced hard campaigning in the Second War when his dad went toe-to-toe with Sir Eyre Coote, and I'm not overstating this. The duel between Coote and Hyder is one of the most sort of like bitterest grudge matches of the 18th century. And it's like up there with Lee and Grant in the Overland campaign, the amount of times they go hammer and tongs with each other, until basically both of them drop dead, is ridiculous. Anyway, he's a soldier. He's not as good as his father, I don't think, but he knows how to die like a man. Supposedly, he was awaiting news of something. He was having his lunch or something like that when word came that the British had got in, and supposedly he immediately asked for his sword and his retinue to come to him and to go immediately to the breaches. He was advised not to do so, and supposedly this is where he says his movie Oscar-winning line, "I would rather live a day as a tiger than a lifetime as a sheep." And he went and fought in the breaches, being handed muskets to fire into the British. Then, as he was trying to retreat from the fortress, probably trying to find a postern gate to get out of into the city, he accidentally got trapped in one of the gateways, which had already been cut off from the other side. Musketry comes from all sides. Everybody is dying in there. It's awful. British troops come in with bayonets, and somebody has a grab at Tipu, and apparently he cuts at them with his sword. He's already been wounded at this point, and then another British soldier shoots him in the head. and he falls, and he's covered almost immediately by other dead bodies falling. And he's identified at the end of the day by either Baird or some people say Arthur Wellesley for some reason, and I have no way of figuring out which one it is. William Dalrymple thinks it's Baird. Richard Holmes thought it was Wellesley. Make up your own minds. The Tiger of Mysore died, fittingly, in a very tigerish manner, and became weirdly a household name in British Indian history. It almost, the way he died so impressed the British. Like they love nothing more than a tyrannical enemy to fight, but they love it if the tyrannical enemy dies like a man, defending, defending there's some sort of old Arthurian kind of thing in the back of the mind of all the British who had like just lapping this up back home when all the paintings start coming out about the death of Tipu and the reports coming out. Turner, the famous artist, paints the storming of Seringapatam. It's one of the most commonly drawn and painted events of the late 18th, early 19th century in Britain. It is a phenomenal moment in history. And the loot is a big part of that as well, which we probably don't have to get, we don't have time to get into, but there are places in Britain which is rooms filled with stuff that guys took out of Seringapatam. It was ridiculous. The amount of wealth they got out of there was calculated at the time in the millions. There was never again to be a prize as rich as Seringapatam. Nothing the British ever took again in India compared to those like 3 or 4 days of looting that the British soldiers got out of that place. And that is the tragedy of Tipu Sultan. Some people think he foresaw the British would be the problem, and nobody listened to him. Some people think he was just an ambitious son of a usurper who was just trying to stay ahead of the game. He's villainized today in his own country as non-Indian because at the second India is run by Hindu nationalist government who don't like him and want to have him expunged from the record because they feel that he was an oppressor, just like the British. So weirdly, they are now allied with the idea of the British Empire that he needed to be taken out. But it's a fascinating story, and there's so much more to Tipu than the caricature of the demon in the river fortress.
I mean, he the death of him, his death, and the way it is sort of blown out of proportion for the British does remind me a little bit of Napoleon. They love to inflate a vanquished enemy, and by God, does the imagery work, right? He's trapped and turned at bay and goes down like a true tiger. Um, the view of him in modern India is utterly fascinating because when the Indian sort of nationalist movement started, he was a hero of it. He was sort of plucked out of it as sort of one of the icons of resistance. So I mean that sort of brings me to our last question rather perfectly, because you've got sort of this Indian nationalist movement, you've got the British, you've got modern India. So in terms of his impact and legacy, how do you balance his rule out?
It's very difficult to balance his rule out because obviously it was unfinished. He wasn't really allowed to rule. He always had to be defending it, as his father had to continually defend it. A lot of stuff was accomplished throughout their reigns, which most people, if you took away from the constant fighting to defend what is legitimately a usurpation of power, it would be seen as very enlightened. The building projects and the civic reforms and things like that they tried to implement is all stuff that new leaders tend to do when they get into power to make people like them, and therefore beneficial. Mysore was very rich, as the British found out, so they were doing something right. In terms of legacy, unfortunately, it is a contested legacy to this day. As you said, it's a really weird twist that you could call it the many lives of Tipu Sultan. Like his actual life the life that the British placed upon him as the great enemy, the his um sort of revival once he was safe and dead to being something of like one of the myths of India, which the British felt happy to kind of continue sort of producing, especially as time went on and distance appeared between them. Then you have the rise of general Indian nationalism in the 40s, and they would look for heroes, they found them, and now with the BJP, he if his name is ever mentioned in connection with the state, it is generally shouted down, and you can get into serious trouble for talking about Tipu Sultan if you're in Indian politics today, as my friend Manimugda Sharma, who was a former reporter for the Times of India, would tell you. And he's much better on Tipu than I am. He should probably have been on this show, but he's very busy. Hello to Manny, by the way. I was recently on a radio, Vancouver radio with him, and we talked about a bit about his legacy, and it is just so complicated because of what people think he stands for and what he can be used to promote or demonize. He's and it's so different from how he was seen at the time by the British at the time, because nowadays you're not going to get nowadays the British don't really care about Tipu. Like more liberal-minded people just see him as something you need to acknowledge as part of the resistance to the British Empire that they will mostly acknowledge again to like the British Empire to be a very flawed thing that we have no real actual connection to anymore, and therefore can look at it objectively. Whereas conservative-minded people will say that Tipu represents something good that the British did because he was a tyrant and he chained people in. They've read Bernard Cornwell and they know that he was chained. He chained people into dungeons and he tortured them, and he's a monster obsessed with cats, crazy cat guy in India. He was the Blofeld of India. So like they'll see him like that and say that he's one of the things that we did good. We got rid of all the psychopaths in their palaces fighting each other. And of course, in India, they are likely to sort of agree with that in the BJP, in the government of India, Mr. Modi's government in India. They would likely be sympathetic to that point of view because they don't like him at all. They think he oppressed Hindus and don't have a great take on the plurality of Indian rule, like native Indian rule in the kingdoms at that time. Likewise, on the other hand, if you happen to be of the opposition faction in India, you might be you might be forgiven for overly lauding him as being too much of a perfect prince and a guy who completely destroyed the British whenever he fought them, and everybody was terrified of Tipu, sort of thing. None of which are particularly true, because the actual truth lies, boringly, rather in the middle somewhere. But it doesn't take away from the fact that I personally think I've been on a journey with Tipu myself. My first take on Tipu was not great because it came from popular fiction and biographies of the Duke of Wellington, which didn't really have time to get into who he was. He was just the monster inside the fortress. So my take on him at first was as the monster. But then I, read more, and I was like, well, why is he the monster? Why is he any worse than any of the other guys hanging around right now? And he's not. Actually, he is a fascinating character and one who can legitimately be seen as heroic in certain, as many people can in certain circumstances.
As is always the case, educating yourself tends to change your perspective from the caricature that we tend to get presented. Luke and I have been having a chat in the background of all of this, not like a rude chat. It's how we manage.
You monsters!
It's how we manage the podcast these days, or at least attempt to manage. would perhaps be a
It's
more
largely my
accurate.
criticisms of Josh, of not Josh, dear Lord. Josh is above criticism. It's my criticisms of Zach going off script.
I'm not very funny, mate, but you had enough experience with this show before you became part of the
No,
assistant
that
management, scholar
is
I
in
did-
residence, all
don't-
people commissariat for the betterment of the public safety of
Mm.
listener podcaster people. Um,
the one title I will not take is anything to do with the Ministry of Public Safety. I draw the line.
we have crossed the line. But we were saying in that chat, at what point does Josh start doing a book that's called The Many Lives of Tipu? Um, because how many times have I told you to try and do something mainstream? For God's
Yeah,
sake, man,
yeah.
do a mainstream popular book. Like Tipu is nicely on the border between mainstream and um, your fascinating, but with the utmost of respect,
Mm.
more niche topics that we love you for, but do a book on Tipu and make many, many pounds out of it. Like
Mm.
maybe even 40.
Wow. What wealth, sir? What wealth do you speak of?
It will be like the sacking of Seringapatam.
Yes. All the wealth of India.
Can I
Um,
just say,
read.
you could probably get away with saying that as an American. I probably couldn't get away with saying that as a Brit.
That is very,
Mm,
very fair.
mm. Uh, Excellent question. Very flattered you think I could take on such a thing. Uh, Weirdly enough, before Professor Andrew Bamford left the Recent Revolution desk at Helion and Company, which is the current publisher I'm with, we had talked about a 2-volume series on the four Mysore Wars, which I still have ambitions to do, but have shelved for now, because apparently Helion is not accepting new stuff at the second, or at least after Andrew left. And so, yes, I am very interested in doing a book. I mean, the book I had intended to write about Mysore was about the wars rather than Tipu himself, because there is already, I believe, a decent biography out there about him, although the take of the many lives of Tipu Sultan might indeed be a different thing, which
Hmm.
I would be very interested in exploring. And if there is any agent or publisher who's listening by some miracle and would like me to do so, do please get in touch with Zach and or myself, and we can talk about that, because I heard it as soon as I said it as well. Like that needs to be a book title somewhere.
My people will talk to their people, who will talk to your people, who will talk to people. And
Mm,
one way or another, we will make this happen in a way that is hopefully much less laborious than that sentence was. Josh, as ever, a huge pleasure to have you on talking about figures who get far less attention than, frankly, they should. Another tour de force. Thank you so much for joining us, folks. You know the drill by now. Every hazard and fatigue on the Siege of Pensacola. Bullets Grain and Good Madeira on the Maratha and Jat campaigns, and Wild East on other stuff.
Japanese affairs.
Yes, that I understand virtually nothing about. These are books that you need in your life. Please go and get your hands on them. Josh, always a pleasure to see you. I'm sure you're still doing stuff for Adventures in Historyland, but these days
Mhm.
Elon doesn't like me actually seeing what any of my friends are doing on social media, because apparently social media is no longer social.
Mm.
But folks, do make sure you're following Josh on social media, and we look forward to having you on again very soon. Hello again, folks. Please remember, we're still fighting back from that Spotify nightmare. So please do 2 really simple and quick things to help us rise from the ashes. First, whack that subscribe button, especially if you're listening to this on Spotify, because you're likely to have been disconnected. But whatever platform you listen to your podcasts on, please just do it anyway to make sure you can stay connected to us. Second, like and leave a comment. It helps bump us up the algorithm to reconnect with our lost audience. If you're a fan of the show, you can leave a 5-star review. Go on, you know you want to. And did you know that you can now join a mailing list to get regular updates on all the news about newly released episodes, meetups for patrons, new lines of merch that have dropped, and all the hot gossip about what's coming soon? Because let's be honest, this show is all about the hot gossip. To sign up, go to www.thenapoleonicwars.net. Much love to all my Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording this in mid-August 2024, are in the mentioned and dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Mars Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schrager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Merlon, and Darla Vincent. And the Admirals: John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Laird Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Mark Chestnut, Jason Morn, and the enigmatically named Zed. And I promise that's not just me boosting the numbers. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.